In today's segment of Ask Backwards, we talk about our weight, right? It's the 2,000-pound elephant in the room, although it's more like the 2,000-pound human in the room. Our weight is a major problem, and very few people are talking about it. As a matter of fact, according to recent research, and you can check this is pulled from the Washington Post from an article, the average American is 33 pounds heavier than the average Frenchman, 40 pounds heavier than the average Japanese citizen, and a whopping 70 pounds heavier than the average citizen of Bangladesh. Together, the world's adult human beings add up to about 287 million tons of biomass, from a study published in BMC Public Health Study. But if every country had the same weight distribution as the U.S., in other words, if all the other countries were as fat as us, the world would be 58 million tons fatter, an increase of 20% in biomass. Now, what does that do to your carbon footprint if you're into that kind of thing? You know, so we as Americans need to quit attacking beef and cattle. We need to quit attacking things that don't matter and really look in the mirror, right? Look in the mirror at ourselves. What can we do to improve? Because tackling obesity is a relatively simple problem. I know it may not seem that way, but it's a very simple problem. If we really want to sum it up, people need to quit eating processed food that's highly caloric and low in nutritional value. They need to move more, and then they need to get in tune more with the community, as opposed to being dialed so deeply into their iPhones and other devices. And so if we could accomplish those three basic fundamental things, we would watch the obesity rates, the epidemic, the true epidemic that's going on in the United States, we would watch that plummet. Now, if you look at this diagram, this is actually published data from the CDC between 1960 and 2010. These are the actual rates of weight of the average Americans. And so you can see the average male, if we go back to 1960, was coming in just around 166 pounds. Whereas today we look at the average male and you're in the mid 190s. So there's about a 35% increase in the average weight of a male in the United States. And if we look at the same trends for females, you know, females were coming in below 140 pounds, and today we're seeing females statistically pushing into the high 160s, right? So women are on average about 18% heavier, men on average are about 17% heavier than their counterparts, you know, from the 1960s. So again, this trend has been going on for a long time. It's not like we're just waking up and saying everybody, you know, got obese overnight. This has been an ongoing battle and an ongoing trend. And, you know, today's leadership, if we look at who today's leadership, as far as who oversees the health of the country and sets policy, we're talking about Health and Human Services of the United States. And if we look at the director of the Health and Human Services, and I'm not putting all the blame on his shoulders, he's an attorney. He really, in my opinion, he's got no place being the director of Health and Human Services as an attorney. Attorneys are not health experts and shouldn't be put in such a prized position. And if you look at his assistant is Rachel Levine, who is a transgender pediatrician, an admiral from the Navy. So at least Rachel has some type of credential, but as we all know, pediatricians don't train in nutrition. And the vast majority of the focus from a pediatric medicine perspective is vaccination. Give more and more of these to prevent disease. So these are our policymakers, at least the ones that are in place right now today. Now, if we look at them historically, they're, in my opinion, most of them are all pretty much the same. They're all unqualified to really fit in that role or be in that role. Most of them have, you know, political aspirations, or they're not qualified to understand nutrition and health, and so they shouldn't be leading the agency that has the highest degree or power to make policy, taking public funds to create policy. If you look at today's HHS, here's their mission statement. You can see it right here. The mission of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services is to enhance the health and well-being of all Americans by providing for effective health and human services and by fostering sound, sustained advances in the sciences underlying medicine, public health, and social services. You can see their current top 5 priorities. Number 1 is ending the pandemic. Well, I think that's over, so maybe we should turn our priorities elsewhere. Number 2, reducing health care costs. Number 3, expanding access to care. Well, how do you expand access to care while simultaneously reducing costs? To me, their focus should be evaluating the current state of care and whether or not it's even effective, but that's another topic. And then you can see the other focus, which again, their big priority is tackling health disparities, as if health disparities are the biggest issue. And then strengthening behavioral health. So what does that really mean, behavioral health? I've seen the woke priorities of this group of individuals would have us all believe that we need to be accepting obesity because obese people are beautiful. As you see on the magazines that are portrayed across the United States, we're trying to normalize obesity instead of tackle it. And so here we have this major problem, and the NHS themselves, or the NIH and the HHS themselves, will tell you that obesity is a risk factor for heart disease and cancer and diabetes and autoimmune disease and a various multitude of problems, and it equates to almost $200 billion of health expenditures annually. And again, this group of government directors has control over the budget and over the money and over the focus of what is being studied and what is actually being implemented. And here their policies are focusing on health disparities as if that's the main issue, and then their other policies are kind of blanketed in this woke agenda. And so they would rather attack things like agriculture, like animal agriculture, and enforce laws or rules where people would be forced to eat more processed foods, which we know is already a dead-end street that leads to disease and illness. So I say this is an ass-backward system. We need to hold these individuals accountable. And if we look at their track record, and I don't want to put all the blame on the current 2 directors because it's not just their fault. They inherited a mess just as well. So we can't just blame them. We have to look at ourselves as Americans. We have to double down and take personal responsibility for our own health and not rely on the government to do it. And I will end this segment just by talking about a couple of different things. We've had what we've seen from our healthcare services, not just in the past 3 years with the epidemic, with the pandemic, but we've seen this really the last 40 years. And that is a very, very reactive leadership. And what I mean by that is, if we just look at the pandemic, the reaction was we need respirators. We're going to approve lots of unproven and unsafe medicines. We're going to shut down the economy. We're going to censor anyone that has half a lick of common sense. We're going to wash our hands and wear masks. We're going to socially isolate from the rest of the world. And we're going to mandate that people get a vaccine that's not been tested or proven to be accurately effective or safe. That's a reactive policy. That's the last 3 years that we've lived through, and it's a very, very failed policy. And I think we, at this point, at this day and age, in this stage, we all know it to be true. What should our leadership moving forward be focusing on if they're going to be proactive at actually solving the true pandemic, the true crisis, which is obesity-driven disease? They should be focusing on policies around incentivizing eating real food, incentivizing farmers to grow real food, not incentivizing huge multiple polypharmacy-owned corporations who are patenting seeds and spraying them with chemicals that have known deleterious effects and growing them in mass quantities and then feeding them to our children in public school systems under the guise of making sure that socioeconomically challenged kids can even eat. We should be focusing on subsidizing. If we're going to subsidize anything, we should subsidize regenerative farming and organic farms, and we should emphasize that, and we should teach it in schools, and we should provide those as school lunches and set an example for the young generation that's coming up behind us. We should make sure that socioeconomically challenged children have access to real food, not to pretend food. We should make sure that we're focusing on educating around stress management, and we should go back to teaching physical education in schools in lieu of taking away physical education so that we can teach children how to memorize and pass standardized tests that don't help them navigate the real world and only serve to graduate kids who can't handle the real world and need safe spaces wherever they go. We should be incentivizing spiritual and moral and ethical behaviors. We should be holding federally funded hospitals and doctors accountable for outcomes instead of incentivizing passive polypharmacy and unnecessary surgeries. We should be banning all direct-to-consumer advertising of pharmaceuticals. It has no place in our world and it's unethical. We should be capping and budgeting the bloated $4.2 trillion that are being spent annually on our new socialized medical health care system. If we start and we really, really want to tackle the issue, those are just some of the things that we could start doing today, that we could start analyzing and start looking at real solutions around those areas and fix this ass backwards situation.